All right, welcome everybody and good morning. My name is Lauren Lutz and I'm joined with my colleague Kirsten DeRoche, and we are here to present to you and facilitate the session entitled Culturally Responsive Teaching and in the Literacy Classroom. We are very excited for today's session. I just have a few things to remind you of before we start. All of our handouts will be put in the chat, but they are also available on the Sched platform. Kirsten's going to put the website address in the chat. Reminder that this is a 75-minute session. We're going to try to stick to an hour with some questions at the end. Also, we have enabled closed captioning. If you click on CC live transcript at the bottom, you'll be able to access the transcript, the live CC captioning. If you have technological difficulties, you'll need to go back to the website that Kirsten posted. You can click on the area above the schedule that says tech support guides. And this is a Zoom meeting. However, we have disabled your ability to turn on your microphone just to eliminate distractions. And you will be unable to turn on your camera, just again, to avoid those distractions. We'd love for you to tweet out and share on social media everything you're learning. The hashtag for our conference is hashtag PaTTAN Lit 2022, and Kirsten will also put that in the chat. And Kirsten is going to get us started.
I am. Thanks, Lauren. Hi, everybody. I'm Kirsten DeRoche, and welcome again to Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Literacy Classroom. So before we begin, I want to make sure that we recognize and commit to some agreements that will help the conversation or help create a safe space for this conversation. When we're talking about things like culturally responsive teaching, we need to make sure that we have an environment where people feel safe to engage. So these 4 agreements come from Glenn Singleton and Curtis Linton's book, Courageous Conversations About Race. And I just want to go ahead and go through those as we begin. So the first is stay engaged. So this is kind of referring to this idea that everybody's present and paying attention and involved in this conversation. So the second one is that you may experience discomfort. So we know that this conversation that we're having today is a 75-minute session. And Lauren and I recognize that there's a lot of work to be done and understanding around culturally responsive teaching practices, and know that moving this work forward is going to take more than just this 75-minute session. So sometimes things that get brought up or brought to the surface or discussed are can evoke these feelings of discomfort within us at certain points. So just know that we recognize that, and I hope that you recognize that and moving forward. Also, that it's in those areas of discomfort that we start to see where healing and change and growth can occur. The third agreement is that we ask that you speak your truth. So this means that you are being open and truthful about the way that you feel and the things that you're sharing, and not just saying what it is that you think that others want to hear or what's quote unquote correct. And the final agreement here is that we can expect and accept non-closure. So this one goes a lot with this idea that we know that this is just one piece in the whole picture of this work around culturally responsive practices. And we're not going to solve all of the problems or concerns or areas that we need to discuss within this 75-minute period. So I just wanted to start with that and just say that we recognize these things moving forward. So our intentions for this session, we're going to go over what is culturally responsive teaching. We're going to look at why culturally responsive teaching is needed. And then we'll look specifically at what does culturally responsive teaching look like within a literacy environment. And I received a text or a message here. I'm going to send this on to Lauren. Actually, if you're sending me private messages, if you wouldn't mind sending those to Lauren while I'm presenting, that would be really helpful. So thank you very much. All right. So I want to give everybody a chance to have a look at these infographics by Sarah Park-Dalen and David Hoyk. Okay, so give you just a minute to have a look. And I want to point out that the data from both of these, 2015 and 2018, is really related to the books that were published in that year. Okay, so just give you a few seconds to continue to look at those. And now, as you're continuing to look, we note that we have various different ethnic groups or main characters across these numbers. And one thing that I noticed when I was looking at this, and Lauren and I were preparing for this, is that each of these kids that we see on each of these has some way that they're looking or reflecting themselves in mirrors. And we can see that starting here with this guy that's over on the far right side, sees quite a lot of himself reflected back in many mirrors. And his emotions are that he's pretty pleased. He feels good about himself there. And as we progress from the right of the infographics to the left, I just wanted you to note that the kids' faces are becoming more and more disappointed or disillusioned. So having a look at this data, initially what we see is that from 2015 to 2018, it looks like we're making progress in that we are seeing more books, children's books, being published with, some incremental changes in seeing more diversity within those characters or those main characters. So this is, initially our look at this is, okay, so we're making some progress. One thing that I wanted to now flip to here is information and data from 2020. And so this is a different infographic, but it's from that same data. So this is more current information about children's picture books that have been published in 2020. And we can see here too that it looks like we're still making some of that same trajectory or that same progress. But one thing that I wanted to note, and I think this comes from Rudine Sims Bishop's article in 1991, somewhere around there, about windows or mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And what she notes is that children need mirrors in their literature or within their classroom to reflect their personal lives, but they also need windows and sliding glass doors. So that's kind of what I think that reflection piece from the other infographic had to do with. And another note that I wanted to have here and kind of discuss with you is this idea that even though we are making progress in seeing more diverse characters in the books that are being published, is that these books that are published are going to go into a larger subset of books or all of the books that have been published from years and years and years ago. So the question is, what were the percentages there? And we need to kind of bear that in mind, that even if we bought all of the books that were published in 2020 for our libraries or our shelves, that they're going in with books that we weren't as cognizant about the culture that the characters were coming from. I also wanted to know, and Lauren and I were talking about this as we were preparing for this, that Larry Ferlazzo is an EL specialist or an English learning specialist. He has a wonderful blog. Lauren, would you put his name in the chat for people? And he has on his blog some really wonderful questions that we can't really delve into in the time that we have today, really in depth, but some questions that can ask as you're looking at the resources. Thank you. The resources that you have, or you're using, or you're choosing in your classroom, to ask yourself who's represented and who's who's not represented? Are there specific groups or kids that don't get to see themselves in mirrors? Okay, so just as an initial thought there. However, culturally responsive teaching isn't, especially in the literacy classroom, isn't just about the resources or the curricular resources that we choose or the books that we have available to our kids. So Zaretta Hammond, who wrote a wonderful book called Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, talks about culturally responsive teaching and defines it as more of a lens by which we are looking at and preparing for our lessons or building our classrooms. It's not just a program or a lesson plan. It's rich, it's intentional, it touches on every aspect of student learning. It requires self-reflection and maybe requiring change within ourselves. I was just in a session with Peg Dawson before coming here, and she made note in that session, which I thought was absolutely on point, this idea that we can't ask the children to change so much as we need to change the environment for them. And I think that that pertains when we're thinking about culturally responsive teaching too. So it also, the other aspect here of culturally responsive teaching is that it has a focus on, oh, thank you, a focus on teacher-student relationship. That's awesome, Michelle. Michelle just sent me a message in the chat that her school did a PD this year using culturally responsive teaching in the brain by Zaretta Hammond. So this is probably pretty familiar to you. That's great. Okay. So why is it important that we talk about culturally responsive practices? And oh man, where's my, here we go. And so when I think one of the things that Lauren and I were really thinking about within this slide was this idea that when we are planning or that we're using the lens that we're typically used to using in thinking about developing our lessons or creating our classroom environment at the beginning of the year, typically we as educators are the center of that. Like, these are the things that I think I need to do in order to meet the standards or to ensure that my students are progressing along a scope and sequence if we're talking about literacy, especially in the younger years. And that idea of placing us as the teacher in the center and then putting those ideas out or using those ideas to develop, when I talk about like changing our lens, that helps us to stop these subconscious influences that can affect students. So what we can see when we are not culturally responsive or we're not using those lenses is that oftentimes students are underestimated, that we think, oh, you're just not ready to get there until you've mastered certain things, and then we'll allow you there. And that in turn leads to not providing as meaningful or as motivating activities and learning objectives for kids, that they don't get to those higher order thinking processes. So one of the big pieces here is that, is this actually an achievement gap that we see between some students of culture and some of our other students, or is it actually an opportunity gap that we've kind of created subconsciously? So some other reasons, and what does wearing those lenses of culturally responsive practices actually do to support students? So it puts kids at the center of our instructional planning, which in turn will raise expectations for our students. You know, we focus on their assets rather than what their deficits may be or what they're not able to do. We're better able to meet their needs. You know, we're not over referring or thinking of kids needing additional supports that we can't provide within our classrooms as often. It helps to build cultural competence. So we learn about other cultures and kids learn about other cultural aspects between their peers and how those can strengthen their group and their class and their learning as well. And it also helps students to feel valued and empowered. So Lauren and I are going to talk about this moving forward a lot this morning, but this idea of it's easier to learn when you feel that somebody's invested in your learning. So just as some other reasons here for what culturally responsive practices can do to support us. Okay, so I want to draw attention to your handouts, and those, I think Lauren has been putting those in the chat, and you can access those on the SCED platform on the PaTTAN Literacy Symposium website.
I'll add them right now.
You rock. Thank you.
In the chat. Yep.
Perfect. And what you'll notice on there, you have two options for handouts. One is a copy of the slides and the other are handouts. And what I'd like you to look at is the culture tree, which is the first page on the handout piece. And this tree is actually a metaphor for the different layers of culture that we need to fully understand as a foundational or as baseline knowledge in order to think about culturally responsive teaching and how we can start to be more culturally responsive in our classrooms. So I want to go over the three different layers that are outlined, but as you're looking at the handout, you can see some other examples here. So one thing that I do want to note is that everyone has a culture. We all do, even when we don't think of ourselves as having a really strong culture or a deep culture. And we all use that culture that we have to make meaning of things that are happening to us and the experiences that we have. So the first layer I want to look at is the surface level culture. So those are our leaves. And these are the aspects that have to do with, that are relatively easy and observable, easy to identify, has to do with your food, any specific dress that you wear that's related to your culture, music that you may listen to, holidays that you celebrate, that kind of thing. So it's important to note that this is often what we see in schools is like, oh, we're having a cultural day where we bring in different foods from our cultures or things like that. And while those are wonderful and nice and beneficial, they don't lead to sustained deeper thinking about culture. They're really only glancing on that surface or those leaf levels. And like, for example, and well, the other thing that I would say too about this layer, this surface level culture, is that we don't have a whole lot of emotional investment in those aspects. Like if they were to change or yeah, if there's any change or things that are going on at this level for kids, there's not a whole lot of emotion that's related to that. So for example, I think about, and Lauren and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday too, this idea that like, if I was to eat spaghetti on a Tuesday, Thai food on a Wednesday, and go for Chinese food on a Thursday, and I am not Italian, Thai, or Chinese in my culture or in my heritage, I don't feel any kind of emotion around switching food types or food cultures for myself. So you can see and kind of equate that there to that emotional level. The next level is here at the trunk, and that's our shallow level. And this level is made up of kind of our unspoken or our hidden rules around everyday type norms and our interactions with others. It's what we consider polite. Our views around age or status or friendship. One example of this is personal space. That's one that we really can kind of understand relatively easily. When this level of culture is violated for us, we do have a strong emotional reaction to that or a charge to that. Okay, so an example would be if you went to the movie theater and there were a lot of open seats and somebody came and sat right next to you, that would be an example of them not recognizing your shallow level of culture and personal space. Or if you're standing in line, I don't know, at an ATM or to check out at, I'm in the eastern part of the state, but at Wawa, and they're standing too close to you, that would violate that. We kind of feel like, ooh, they're a little too close. I wish they would back up. Those feelings of uncomfortableness are when that shallow level is violated. And then finally, the deep level, or the roots. These are those cultural aspects that go to the core of our belief system. So our morality, our ethics, our religious, spiritual pieces that are at our hearts. And this level really determines how we learn and take in new information. So this is really, the roots are really the important piece to creating a culturally responsive environment. So if we are challenged at this level, it can be interpreted as a threat, as a shock, and it can create even this like trigger or this fight or flight response. So examples of those you can kind of see on the tree in your handouts. Okay, Lauren, did you have anything to add to this, or we're?
No, we are good to go. Keep rolling.
Okay, good. All right. So we already noted that this book was used pretty thoroughly. Like Lauren and I have really relied heavily on Zaretta Hammond's work from the book Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And what we're going to look at now is also in your handouts. It's on the second page, but is a framework that she provides known as the Ready for Rigor framework. And in this framework, she notes that this is the foundation of culturally responsive teaching. And she has these 4 areas: awareness, learning partnerships, information processing, and community building. We're going to spend some time for the remainder of the morning kind of looking at each one of these 4 a little bit more in depth. I also wanted to kind of let you guys know that the framework doesn't have to be utilized within a literacy environment. It can be used in any subject area or any area. I also keep thinking about it within professional development and also my home life too in certain aspects. But we're then going to look at each one of these pieces and how they can be applied to a literacy environment. Okay. Oops, sorry. A little bit froggy. 1 second. Okay, so the first principle that we want to address is this principle of awareness. Okay, so we need to know about ourselves and our own cultural lenses deeply and understand those so that we can start to recognize cultural aspects in other people. And as educators, that those other people, would be our colleagues, but also our students. And how that understanding and that awareness can help us to not be the center of classroom instruction and understanding, and center our students and their needs more so. So in your handout, you will see a larger version of this personal and social identity wheel. What I'd like you to do is have a look at that wheel a little bit and think about how you might define yourself within some of these personal and social identities. One thing that I wanted to note is that personal identities are those individual traits that make up kind of who you are. They're often we're often able to kind of choose those. They include like your hobbies, your interests, experiences that you may have had, and other kind of personal choices. And since those are things that you get to choose, those are kind of what you oftentimes want to put out into the world, or how you like to have other people view you. And social identities are much more of how we other people would categorize us, or how we would categorize other people based on their identities. So they can influence things like, I don't know, characteristics of a particular group, people with a common history or a nationality. They can be shaped by things that have happened across history or even day-to-day interactions. So An example here would be like, depending on the social class that you grew up in, that may have an impact on how you view education and formal education. And that can then become a trajectory to kind of what profession you aim yourself at. So what I'd like you to do is kind of think about these as I'm kind of talking here. And are there some that you would view more important than others? Which are most important to you? Why do you think those are more important to you? And how does this identity that you're kind of thinking about shape your views around, for example, education or learning or even literacy? I did want to share too that my father came from, I was kind of thinking about this as I was preparing this, but my father came from a family that were low socioeconomic status. And he was told growing up, you need to go to college, you need to go to college, you need to go to college. Added on top of that, my father struggled to learn literacy and spelling. And so he never really saw himself, he wanted to see himself as a learner after high school, but didn't know if that was really possible. So that was really, really important in his life. Now, flash forward, he did, and he went on to many different things, but that was a driving force for him. Whereas as his child, I didn't have those same feelings in the time period that I grew up, and where I grew up, it was just kind of known that that was something that I was going to do. So my views on those are very different. So what I'd like to do now, and I don't know, Lauren, if they can't chat to everybody, they probably won't.
They can. I changed it.
Okay, thank you. I just realized that after we had that conversation.
Yep, they can chat with everyone now.
What I'd like to do now is a very quick waterfall. And a waterfall is where you're going to put something into the chat, but don't hit return until I say go. So what I'd like you to put into the chat is one identity that stands out to you or is important to you, or one way that you identify, either personal or social. Okay.
And it could be the most important thing, right, Kirsten?
Yeah, whatever.
Most important.
Most important. Yeah, that would be good. So most important. And when I say go, you're gonna hit return, and they will all flow through the chat so we can see what everybody else sees as their most important. Okay, so I'll give you I'm going to do a countdown from 3 here. So when I say go, you're going to hit return. 1, 2, 3, go. Family, Christian, mom, lifelong learner, communication, neurodiverse, able-bodied, family, excellent, excellent. So what we can see as you're looking and seeing everybody's most important identity is that we all identify and see and have certain aspects that are more important than to us than others, and they're different amongst even us all here together at this.
And Kirsten, I do also want to point out some of the things that you might see. You might be thinking that would be the last thing on my list, but that's what we're trying to point out, is that to others, this might be of utmost importance to them, which is just changing the lens with which we look at situations.
Right. And you and I had that conversation too. I know that I said that being a woman was very important to me, and something that stands out as really a lens by which I look at the world as a woman. And Lauren said, that's not one that I think about regularly at all. And so I just challenge you moving forward as a thought moving forward, and not to necessarily like have this discussion about this right now, but like, what is it about this most important identity about you that why do you think that that's most important, and how does that lens affect the way that you look at the world and make decisions and learn new information? Okay, so final little bit here on connecting awareness to literacy is that, and I think this just is summarized in this little quote that's here on this post-it on the slide, that when that all instruction is culturally responsive, the question is, to whose culture is it actually responding? So when we understand our own cultural reference points, we're better able to recognize that others also have cultural reference points or different cultural reference points. And we need to learn to expand our understanding of learning to include these different displays. And we talk a little bit more about that as we move through the other components of the Ready for Rigor learning partnership. So for example, are those resources, books, instructional choices that we make as educators taking into consideration other social and personal identities that our students may bring to the table? Okay, so second part of the learning or the Ready for Rigor framework is learning partnerships. So within learning partnerships, there are three major components. There's the pact, that's an agreement between the teacher and the student. It should be kind of developed together over time and include learning targets that are developed together and that are attainable, small, specific, and relevant to the student. The next piece is the teacher as the warm demander. We're going to look at this in a few minutes. And the final piece is that the student is taking ownership of his or her learning. So they need to understand. So within this component of the Ready for Rigor framework, we need to understand why relationships are critical, that partnerships help dependent learners become more independent, that trust within our students and between us and our students starts with being a good listener and listening on both sides, and that this is an alliance or an alliance, I think that's the best word, between the teacher and the student, providing quality feedback to the student and the student providing it to us. And we can help our students then restore confidence in themselves as a learner. So I'd like you in your handouts to now find the warm demander chart, which is after the social and the social identity wheel. And within here, I'd like you to have a look through these different teacher types and think about yourself as an educator. Think about your teaching styles. Which aspects from any of all four of these would you use to describe yourself? So one of our goals in learning partnerships is for us as the teacher to become the warm demander, or to fall as often as possible in these characteristics of the warm demander. This is like kind of that sweet spot, right, for building these learning partnerships. And this is really integral into infusing these culturally responsive teaching practices. Okay. This learning demander piece requires a teacher to have a blend of kind of helping students to have personal growth, but also that zone of proximal development, that right point of kind of stretching but not straining our students in their learning. Now, one thing that I did want to note in thinking about the warm demander chart is that you may find that as you're looking at this, I kind of fall a little bit more into the technocrat as I think about myself, pretty honestly, or more in the I can't even say that word, sentimentalist quadrant. And that's okay. It's okay to move between some of these characteristics. Just know that the goal in creating culturally responsive practices is that you want to be in that sweet spot as much as possible, or as often as possible. I think about like the teachers that I had that made a lasting impact on me. I think about my high school German teacher and even my high school Algebra 2 teacher. And what really stood out to me was the fact that a lot of their characteristics fell within this warm demander piece. I felt like I could do it. I felt motivated, and that was through their encouragement and their being those warm demander characteristics. I knew they cared.
Kirsten, I did want to mention to everybody also, because not only think about your own teachers, but if you think back to a year where you had a student that you really felt like you made a breakthrough with that child? Because we all know the teacher before you was like, let me see your list. Oh, you have that one. That's never a good feeling. But did you ever have that kid that came to you and you were like, wow, I really made a connection? And think back, what characteristics from this teacher type, these 4 teacher types, did you really display with that student that you made that connection with? And so that's really what we want to be thinking about, is what types of qualities enable that strong relationship with students. That connection.
Yeah, and how do we emulate that and replicate that in other situations with other kids? That's a good point, Lauren. Thank you. Okay, so the important piece in thinking about shifting mindset here is that we're helping students to see themselves differently. And I was thinking about that in relationship to my high school German teacher that I mentioned, and even Mr. Spears, my Algebra 2 teacher, and even the students that Lauren's saying, that somebody, I will never forget some of those students that I was told, oh man, let me see your class list, right? And I was like, I'm nervous about this. But the important piece here is that we were able to help, in those situations, I was able to connect with that kid and help them understand. Some people refer to this as the power of yet. Like, they may not be doing everything that I would hope that they are doing, but that they're working towards that. And they believe that they can. So this is really about shifting mindset within our students, and not so much about shifting it just within ourselves. And I just love this quote from Vincent van Gogh that just is like, I'm always doing what I cannot do yet in order to learn how to do it. Trisha, I see your comment, and I know he's still doing a lot for kids. So that's great. Okay, so ultimately, relationships are at the heart of it. We can only control what's happening within the school, within the classroom, within our own scope of influence. So when kids are coming into a shared space, we want them to make sure that they're feeling accepted and valued, and then that frees up the other parts of their brain to be able to learn. So being in a environment where they have a relationship with a teacher kind of primes that pump for them to be able to take in that information and feel safe. Okay, so this is part of the reasoning why I love what I do, why I love teaching, and why I got into teaching. So connecting learning partnerships to literacy instruction. So these bullet points that are on here are some that come directly from and can be applied to a manner of content area. But what do they look like within a literacy classroom? So using student-friendly terms could be, do your students really understand and know what you're looking for when you say, I want you to work on your fluency or your accuracy? Have you showed them what it doesn't look like? Have you defined it in ways that they can understand? Providing checklists to help with decision-making skills. So checklists are really helpful in scaffolding instruction in a lot of different circumstances. One example that, Lauren and I were kind of, I like what you say there too, Michelle. So talking about this in relationship to checklists, and we were thinking about how a checklist could be used within a secondary ELA setting, or even younger kids if they needed it, as a contrastive analysis for students who come with different language backgrounds. And it can help, one side of the checklist could have, I don't know, some grammar points that you're working on within academic English. And the other side could have, I don't know, some patterns from the language that they're loved in at home that they should be on the lookout for, and how they could change that language to then be more academic English.
And I do want to point out that Zaretta does mention that in her book, with African American vernacular is what she uses as her example, but lots more examples in the book.
Yeah, and it's not limited to just that. It's any language that they come to, or come with. So you could also use tools for students to track their own progress, could be graphs, charts, an actual physical thing that they can look at, or it could be a recording. And Lauren and I were talking about how Seesaw has been used recently for kids to record themselves and share that with parents, but they can look back at the progress that they've made in their reading fluency or their prosody. We were talking about engaging in metacognitive conversations and providing even sentence starters when kids are doing some pure editing on something that they're writing. So giving them a sentence starter, for example, like one thing I really liked about your story was, gives them that place to start so that that they're on track when they're doing that pure editing, but also that they're able to be reflective and that that they're getting something from that pure editing from their peer as well. You could provide word banks. Whoops, I went a little too far there. Word banks that give them additional words on top of those sentence starters as well. So lots of different ideas. And I'm going to go ahead and flip this here and turn it over.
I guess I'm on.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Give me 1 second to get myself ready. Okay. So I'm just going to pick up with the information processing part of this framework. And up until this point, we've talked about the necessary conditions for learning, being aware, creating those learning partnerships. But information processing is the third part of this Ready for Rigor framework. It's the concept of taking facts and ideas and turning them into usable knowledge. So we as teachers should know, which we will talk about, how the brain processes information. But as Hammond points out in her book, we also need to understand how culture impacts the brain's information processing system. So we'll talk about that after we talk about how the brain works. And when we pair those two together, we can organize learning to build brain power of our students. And through our understanding of culturally responsive teaching, we can promote information processing and encourage independent thinking and provide students with access to higher order thinking tasks. Sorry, trying to move my stuff around here. Geez, oh man. Okay. So first, we're going to talk about how the brain processes information. Hammond, in her book, likens this to a power plant processing material as it goes through different stages. And that's exactly what cognitive scientists have basically researched. And they refer to these stages as input, elaboration, and application. So with input, the brain is basically deciding what information is important. What am I going to pay attention to with all the stimuli being thrown at me? So am I going to pay attention to the teacher who's teaching me a new syllable type? Is it the kid next to me who's drawing on his desk? The boys outside playing at recess, the teachers in the hall who are talking, the radiator that's making that incredible noise that I can't concentrate? Your brain decides what are you going to pay attention to. And that's where your working memory is kind of holding things on a clipboard almost for 5 to 10 seconds. And your brain is going to decide, is this worth me investing my time? And if so, it's going to move it over to working memory so that you can connect with it even more. So you're placing that temporary information on that clipboard in your short-term memory, and then it kind of has to fade out to make room for new information. So when you think, like, where have you been for the last 2 minutes? I mean, think about that, 5 to 10 seconds. Sometimes I zone out for 10 seconds and I have no idea what's happening. So that's really important to know. And then we move to the elaboration stage, which is where your working memory is literally working to grasp onto this information, and it's seeking out features related to similarities and differences of content. And our brains are pattern seeking. Cognitive scientists know that. We seek patterns, and our job as educators is to help students in identifying the patterns. So the brain is attempting to understand how things are organized in a larger system. They're trying to connect concepts, and we as teachers connect the dots. And typically we all know that we need to be doing this. Connecting back to awareness, when you're aware of different cultural displays and interaction, you can better connect the learning to the students who are sitting before you. So like I said, we call this working memory, which is fitting because it's literally working to assimilate all this new information. And it's during this stage, we're going to talk about this on the next slide or 2 slides, where we introduce culturally responsive teaching tools. And I'll talk about that in a second. So the brain then has to practice what has been learned. So it's use it or lose it at this point. If you want that to transfer into long-term memory, this is where application stage basically happens. So the brain, based on age, will stop collecting information after 12 to 20 minutes to kind of process what it's been given in its working memory. Then it'll cycle down, then it'll start again. So you have, that 12 to 20 minutes based on age. Then the brain will shut down and try to absorb what's happening, and then it will cycle through again. It'll be ready to learn more. When you think about a typical 42-minute class period in a high school or middle school setting, I remember going into classes where my teacher would start when the bell rang and my teacher would stop talking when the bell rang, and there was no time to, quote, chunk and chew is how they refer to it, that information. And that's what the brain needs to process that information. So your brain has 24 to 48 hours to revisit, review, and apply what has been learned. So if you think about that, 1/3 of the way into your class, we need to use it or lose it, because we need to create those footpaths. I know we talk about this in literacy all the time, that that orthographic mapping, that bridge from the phonological to the orthographic processor, and we need to make that bridge. We need to make that a trodden path. That's what you're doing when you go through this application stage and you're building up that myelin sheath. We also want you to think about one more thing though. Our goal for our students is it really to be masters of the material that we're teaching, or is it to have our students become expert learners who can be independent and rise to challenges? So just like Kirsten said, I'm pretty sure, did you say German maybe, Kirsten? I'm pretty sure you can't speak German, or maybe you don't even remember, what you learned in algebra about, poly or binomials, factoring binomials. I'm not really sure, but you probably remember the teacher, and you have become an expert learner. You're a self-sufficient learner from the things that they helped you to do. Same thing with me. So in thinking about that, students being independent learners, expert learners, most students are going to need scaffolding to help them to become expert learners. And if we know how the brain processes information, we can set students up for success. This is also the goal when we talk about UDL, or Universal Design for Learning. So you can see that little sticky note in the corner there. It says action and expression, engagement, representation. Those are the 3 guiding principles of Universal Design for Learning, which is just a way of thinking about teaching and learning that gives all students an equal opportunity to succeed. It offers flexibilities in the ways students access material, they engage with it, show what they know. Kirsten is going to put the link to the CAST website in the chat. If you haven't heard of Universal Design for Learning, it is well worth your while to check out that resource. You can find a ton of information, including information about those guiding principles. And those guiding principles help us to promote and engage learners to optimize the relevance, value, and authenticity of the tasks at hand. That relates back to awareness and those learning partnerships, to make things authentic for those students. We know our students, we can make things authentic for them. To minimize threats and distractions, that is that learning partnership, making them feel safe in the classroom. We encourage sustaining effort and persistence. We vary the demands on students and the resources. We want to optimize the challenges. Foster collaboration and community. All of this ties into this Ready for Rigor framework. So they really kind of go hand in hand and lend themselves to one another. And we can generalize all of this across every content area and apply it in any situation. So it is worth your while to check out the UDL website, because there's lots of resources there. So now we get to, how does this work in a literacy classroom, and some final thoughts about information processing. If we think back to these descriptors, we as culturally responsive teachers are the bridge that helps students connect those dots, process what they're learning. And as it relates to literacy, we can do the following things. So when we design lessons, we can be thinking back to that tree that Kirsten showed you about those 3 layers of culture. Are there aspects to your lesson that provide a deeper connection? Are we just on the surface here? Or are we really thinking about those deep roots and the things that are personal to students, not just surface level things? Humans tend to be not as invested as in our beliefs about those things. Just like Kirsten said, the food that you're eating, the holidays that you celebrate. I'm taking religion out of that. I'm just saying in general holidays that you celebrate. But we need to kind of invest in those deeper level details within our lessons. And students need to be engaged in the learning, and accessing that deep culture is a way to help engage them and promote engagement. So I talked about culturally responsive teaching tools. And what I meant was, and this is all from Zoretta's book, these are not my thoughts. I believe that these are hers. But she talks about movement, repetition, story, metaphor, and music, which is a common multicultural attention-getting cue, to help the brain process. She talks about call and response. If you think about Hegarty, if you think about enhanced core reading instruction, where there's a, my turn, your turn, that call and response, provocations like showing videos and photographs, she mentions, which primes the brain, catches students off guard, it increases the impact. But one thing that she says is that the goal isn't just engaging students, it's engagement so that the brain is paying attention. Remember that clipboard. And the brain is going to decide what's important. These are the things that can help the brain say, okay, maybe this is important to me. We have to make students understand the why. We have to give them the why for what they're learning. And if we can connect it back to that deep culture, they have a better chance of moving that into working in long-term memory. We can make direct connections to what is known and what isn't known when we choose a text that provides a window into another person's experience that our students don't have connections with. We need to help them make those connections. I remember teaching 4th grade and I read Maniac Magee every year, and every year the kids in my classroom could not understand, because of where I taught, they did not understand why, if you haven't read Maniac Magee by Jerry Spinelli, there's a black and white part of town, and the white kids were daring him, double dog daring him to go to the black side of town. And Maniac was like, okay, no problem. And the kids in the classroom couldn't understand the feelings of those students and why they weren't willing to go to the other side of town. So, you're providing a window, especially when we read complex text. There are characters that are experiencing emotions that some of our students don't have any connection with. And that's where we need to really hone in and try to help make those connections and relate it back to what's going on in their own lives. And then finally, building those cognitive routines. For example, with word learning, we can teach students, if you caught Deb Glazer's session yesterday on morphological analysis, she was talking about teaching them strategies on how to look at words. Teaching them those routines will help with that cognitive load. We could teach students to look for cognates, for example, Luna or lunar, having to do with the moon, and providing a checklist with English cognates for whatever language the student is their language that they're loved in at home. So effective teachers can integrate both the reader and the text. When the purpose of the reading is comprehending the meaning, we can provide them with lots of scaffolds there. And I wanted Kirsten to mention, because I'm going to go back 2 slides very quickly. Let me see. Right here. This slide here says, help students process new content using methods from oral traditions. That's something that Zoretta Hammond mentions. And Kirsten, I want you to tell that story really quick, because I know we're running out of time.
So we were talking about this a little bit yesterday, in firming up our presentation for today, but I was realizing that there was a situation that I had experienced personally where I was teaching, and I think it was like 5th grade, but I was doing a unit on different genres in our ELA block, and talking about the difference between fairy tales and other genres, and we were specifically focused on fairy tales. So we were reading, I don't know what it was, if it was like Sleeping Beauty or Cinderella from Ireland, and the Cinderella from Italy, and then an African version, and kind of comparing those, and then talking about the various characters and the characteristics of that genre. And there was a conversation that I was having with the students in my class, and this is an example of kind of how I thought the lesson was going to go in a very specific way. And I was talking to them about that character within those fairy tales that's, kind of a negative piece, or gives them some kind of a barrier or something that they need to overcome within that story or within those fairy tales. And I was talking to my students. I taught in Phoenix, Arizona at the time, and was talking to them kind of about, oh, well, it's kind of like a boogeyman or a wicked witch or this kind of a thing. And their response to me was like, oh, that's like the chupacabra. And I had no idea what who chupacabra was. And so there was this kind of like back and forth between us about me learning that the chupacabra was the monster from the mountains that comes and sucks the goats versus what I knew from my oral traditions growing up, which is that, wicked witch or boogeyman kind of thing.
So yeah, and so Kirsten mentioned yesterday, she was the one that got the lesson that day, not the kids, but had she had the forethought to be aware of their culture at that time, she could have planned that into the lesson, and they might have been able to move that into their long-term memory a little easier had they had that connection. So that was the point. So our final Ready for Rigor framework piece is the community of learners and learning environment. You can read the slide yourself. I'm not going to read this to you, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but we all want to create a positive classroom environment, and that's what this is. But it's creating processes and structures that permit students a sense of community as intellectual learners. It's not just creating bulletin boards that have, characters from books that are not white. That's not what we're talking about here. So creating that community of learners and learning environment so students feel safe. In preparation for this symposium and this presentation, I watched another culturally responsive teaching webinar. And I cannot remember the woman's name who did it, but what she said was, and I never thought about it this way, she said, when I left home, the language at home was the language at school. The culture at home was the culture at school. I felt safe at home. I felt safe at school. There was no difference. Home, school, work, everything was the same. But she said, for a lot of our students, the culture at home is not the culture at school. And when they come to school, they don't feel safe because it's not their culture. It's different. And so we have to look at our classroom through the lens of all the different characteristics, qualities, cultures that are being represented in our classroom so that we can make a community of learners and make it safe for them. Kirsten loves this quote by Esther Perel. You can't play when you're vigilant. You can't play when you're anxious. You can't play when you're fearful. You can't play when you don't trust. You have to feel safe to play. Well, I would argue you can't learn when you're vigilant. You can't learn when you're anxious. You can't learn when you are fearful and when you don't trust. So in order to learn, we have to feel safe. And that's what this community of learners and learning environment is really talking about. So, we can't learn unless we feel valued and comfortable, and we can use routines to lighten the cognitive load for students, the routines that we talked about. And they also allow the teacher to focus on meaningful instruction. That's why we talk about explicit teaching, direct instruction, so that we can focus on meaningful instruction and less about the words that we're filling in for what we want our students to learn. We can model routines for our student. It helps the brain in learning. And then finally, we've provided you a resource in your handouts. This is not from Hammond's book, but this is from getsupported.ed, getsupported.net, I think. I'm sorry, it is in our, it's going to be in our final resources. It's on our final slide, but I think it's getsupported.net or .com. But anyway, there's a checklist there. And that it's a tool that can help you gauge how you're supporting and valuing all of your students. It has like 26 look fors, and you might find it helpful in identifying your glows and grows. There's 5 guiding principles of culturally responsive teaching. It's like an assets view versus a deficits view, support and challenging students, putting students at the center of learning. So what I want you to think about, though, is as I was preparing for this, I thought, well, I do that, but I'm certain I'm just thinking of it at a surface level. And this checklist might help you to think more deeply about your own practice. And our final notes as we conclude, right on time, Kirsten, I might add, it's 1 hour exactly. To be culturally responsive, we have to understand the role of culture in education and through society, and take responsibility to learn about our students, their culture, their community, and use that culture as the foundation, as an asset, not a deficit. And then design and deliver instruction in that caring, warm demeanor manner. And we can use those academic experiences that connect the students' perspectives to like the larger social context, but more intentionally. We want you to personally evaluate your practices. No one is perfect. And as Kristen mentioned at the top of this hour, this is 1 hour of the grand scheme of things. This is 1 hour to kind of reflect and think about change, but the work cannot end in this hour. It's there's a lot of work that has to be done to create that culturally responsive classroom, community, school, and this is just 1 hour of your day. So please keep that in mind. We're not trying to simplify this in any way, but when you're only given an hour, you kind of have to simplify. So that's the material that we wanted to provide for you to start you on your journey. And our email addresses are here. If you'd like to email us with any questions, feel free to copy them down. Kirsten, I don't know if you can type those into the chat so people can easily get them. And then Kirsten is also going to paste in the chat a Padlet that I found. I did not create, I won't take credit for it, from Get Supported. It's from supported.com, and it's a culturally responsive teaching Padlet. I do believe that it was originally created for teachers of ELLs, English language learners, but I believe that you can use that information across all cultures, not just for English, not just for English language learners. I think for across every culture, you'll be able to use that website to help you. And then in our handouts, at the very end, these are the references that we use. So if you're interested in any of the things that we talked about, they are there.